And one other thing to note is I am recording this to the cloud from my computer in Seoul, South Korea. So I'm hopeful that that does not introduce a wrinkle that causes issues for us. But here we are. It is the third meeting of our glorious society, the International Society for the Study of Decentralized Governance. I've just gone around the room and introduced the attendees. But what I'd like to do now is have our speaker speak up, introduce himself clearly into the microphone, and go ahead and start your presentation, which means I'll stop sharing my screen and you'll start sharing yours.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Thomas. Let me quickly organise myself now. Before I introduce myself and before I actually get going, I'm just going to make sure that everyone can see my screen and also everyone's seeing the changes for the slides as I go through, because last time I presented, unfortunately, everyone enjoyed the title slide, so we don't want that to happen again. But it looks like that's all working fine, so I'll begin. So my name is Alastair Berg. I'm one of the researchers at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub here in Melbourne, Australia. So I'm a researcher. I'm also a PhD student. Now, most of us already know what the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub do, so I don't think I'll introduce the hub. And what I might actually do is just, in the interest of time, get straight into the presentation. So this presentation that I'll be presenting today is called Blockchains and Constitutional Catallaxy. So this is actually based on a working paper which is written by myself, Chris Berg and Michaela Novak as well. So all three of us are from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. This was written and finished late last year. This is also being presented at the Australasian Public Choice Conference, which we presented late last year. So this is the paper. So you're all welcome to see the paper. It is up on SSRN, which is an open repository of social science research. So you're all welcome to see it. There's no paywalls or anything like that. But we can also put some links up if you are interested in seeing the whole thing. Okay, so this is briefly what I'm going to do today over the next 20 minutes or so. So first of all, I'll be characterising the rules which govern blockchain technology and blockchain platforms as fundamentally constitutional. What I'll then be doing is describing what we are calling constitutional catallaxy. So in the context of blockchains, which we see is really central because these technologies, or this technology, is quite adaptive and emergent, and it's obviously an up-and-coming technology. So for the purposes of this paper, we're talking about Bitcoin and EOS, but we think the arguments are fairly well generalisable. And then finally, I'll be presenting the catalactical model of constitutional design, which is one where blockchain users participate in a really continuous process of debate and change over the rules of rules, or the meta rules, if you will. But first of all, some brief definitions, because I understand that there might be some terms, or certainly at least one term which may be new to other participants on the call. So catallaxy is a term which was really popularised by two economists, von Mises and Hayek. So they fundamentally use the term as a distinct alternative to the term economics. So what Mises and Hayek, and I believe there were some earlier scholars who used the term as well, but it's very much popularised by these two. They use the term to take into account the fact that economics and exchange is fundamental on networks of competing individuals serving very distinct goals and aspirations. So they very much emphasise exchange rather than choice, as well as cooperation, where what they termed enemies come into become friends. And a constitution, of course, is just the legal, technical, norm-based rules which constrain and guide economic and political activities. And this is very much in the context of scholars such as Buchanan and such as Tulloch, which I know that some people on this call, such as Thomas Cox, has been, and Brendan, I imagine, have been reading as well. So the actual guts of the talk, I'll begin now. So I'll really quickly talk about the concept of constitutional catallaxy as we use it in this paper. So the catalactical model of constitutional arrangements is best considered as reframing or in contrast to the contractarian model, which is illustrated by scholars including Brennan and Buchanan. And by the way, there's a reference list at the end of this as well, which you can use. So in the contractarian model, constitutional arrangements, they serve as meta rules of the game for organisation and conduct of some political jurisdiction. So this is including with respect to the rule of law, the treatment of citizens by the state, and so on. And from this literature, we get generic constitutional design rules such as the veil of uncertainty. So this contractarian model consists of a very neat delineation between a constitutional stage and a post-constitutional stage. So the rules are set at time A, and then at time B, the game is played, if you will. So in contrast, this catalactical model attempts to account for the choice of constitutional rules and is one which is dynamic and one which is subject to regular amendments, or at least attempts at amendments. So as described here, it is a dynamic, it is an open-ended and a contestable process between vying interests in political space, and is one in which comes out of some relatively new literature, including some work done by one of my co-authors, Michaela Novak. So we consider blockchains as a really novel way for users to come to consensus over some shared truth without any reliance on the actions of central authorities. So when we consider them as a class of ledger technology, blockchain provides rules related to value, so such as the total supply of a cryptocurrency, the supply algorithm which governs it over time. We also see rules within protocols which constrain the actions of participants, rules which govern the ways in which smart contracts are executed on protocols, and also rules related to the way in which consensus over the contents of a shared ledger is reached. So in a forthcoming paper, Rajagopal describes blockchain protocols as consisting of both constitutional and ordinary rules. And in this context, the code of blockchain constrains the actions of individual participants. So in this sense, code operates as a constitutional constraint or constitutional constraints. So as we all know, or as most of us know, blockchains use asymmetric cryptography, they use peer-to-peer networking and economic incentives to allow a dispersed group of users to come to consensus over the state of some shared ledger. So of course, as we know, this technology was first developed in order to allow users to transact value across the internet without some intermediary to maintain user balances. But it's subsequently become a way in which users can reach collective decisions outside of the realm of traditional hierarchies and traditional political institutions. So what we're using in this paper is this post-contractarian breakthrough of Constitutional Catallaxy to study blockchain technology, both at the design stage, so when the code is actually being written from the first instance, as well as a subsequent dynamic process whereby these blockchain protocols are upgraded. So the decentralized nature of blockchain protocols, that means that no one individual usually or theoretically has absolute power over their governance, and obviously there are certain protocols which go along that spectrum. But different classes of users derive varying levels of influence due to things like technical ability, due to things like their holdings of tokens, as well as their reputation amongst the group of users. So the process of constitutional catallaxy and what we call constitutional entrepreneurship is examined in the context of two blockchain protocols. And as I mentioned, we're examining both Bitcoin briefly and EOS in a little bit more depth. So we can consider the Bitcoin protocol as both a payment system and a monetary system. So the protocol itself provides a mechanism by which users can transact value over the internet, so in a peer-to-peer fashion. So this was the breakthrough of blockchain. This is the killer app of blockchain that we saw 10 years ago. However, it also contains certain rules about money supply, block times, the validity of transactions, or transactions that aren't valid, which provide for predictable monetary arrangements. So in the sense, at least from a monetary, from a money supply perspective. So this is in the context of what's known as monetary constitutionalism. So predictable money supplies. So the early days of the Bitcoin protocol involved unilateral constitutional design through the person or persons of Satoshi Nakamoto. So for instance, the entire suite of meta rules upon which the Bitcoin protocol was initially formed was unilaterally designed by this one person or perhaps multiple people. We of course don't know. The 21 million Bitcoin, which will be in existence by mid next century-ish, the supply schedule of those coins and other rules which are related to block size, they were all just decided by this potentially one person. So in the 10 years since, efforts to change the protocol reflects the difficulties of distributed decision-making in the presence of varying incentives and technical abilities of different users. And this is, of course, largely derived from the exponential growth of users in the protocol, as well as the disappearance of Nakamoto, along with any reputational authority this might have afforded him or her or they, were they still around. So EOS, of course, is well known to a lot of people on this call. EOS is a more well-known, a more recent blockchain protocol, which was designed to rival smart contract platforms such as Ethereum. It was released in June of last year. I was about to say this year, but last year, in order to provide for faster transaction speeds, and it uses a consensus mechanism called delegated proof of stake. So in contrast to Bitcoin and currently other platforms such as Ethereum, validating nodes are limited by economic resources. Mining in the Bitcoin ecosystem, of course, requires access to capital equipment in the form of currently ASIC miners, as well as access to electricity to cool them. And EOS validators, which are known as block producers, are voted in by token holders. So the number of these block producers are also limited to 21, such as there are 21 block producers earning fees in the form of EOS inflation at any one time. So this, in effect, gives EOS block producers the power to allow or prevent code and transactions from being propagated on the EOS blockchain. So prior to the June launch of EOS, an online discussion and debate about the EOS constitution was conducted via various means, including all the usual suspects such as Telegram, Reddit, Twitter, and other messaging platforms. A version of the constitution was, and still is, held on the GitHub software repository. So this draft constitution, which of course Thomas had a lot to do with, included articles covering things like dispute resolutions, restitution, vote buying, as well as how the constitution might be amended in the future. So, although as serious and diligent efforts have been made to provide the EOS community with platforms by which they could consider and debate the contents of the EOS constitution, the constitutional process was and still remains limited by the lack of any mechanism to signal support or otherwise through constitutional arrangements. So at the moment, and bear in mind that this paper was written in November of last year, so any changes since then will not be reflected in this talk or this paper. But at the moment, there's no referendum system by which EOS users can vote for constitutional measures formally. And similarly, during this catalactical process, and in part owing due to the decentralized nature of most blockchain protocols, there is currently confusion over which constitution is the constitution, or at least one which would be subject to any future vote. So this has seen competing constitutions, many of which are very similar, but nonetheless vary in key articles. So for instance, a number of constitutions available online vary in rules of arbitration and dispute resolution. So what this illustrates is the novel ability for any party to put forward a suggested version of the constitution, and indeed, in addition to similar constitutions, an entirely new constitution has been proposed to supersede the versions just discussed. So up until this point, the ability to put forward similar or amendments of constitutions or entirely new constitutions has been constrained in the political sphere. So this is not least due to the close physical proximity in which constitutions have typically been drafted and debated. with physical proximity, version control is typically easier to maintain in contrast to online deliberations. So these dynamic and emergent meta rules, which are drafted and debated and amended at will by members of the EOS community, raise some fundamental questions over what it actually means to consent or to give consent to be governed under a blockchain-based constitutional order. So is it merely by using a protocol that consent is implied? And in the case where there are multiple competing constitutions, how does one actually signal or how does one signal that consent is given to be governed under any particular version when there's no obvious way to do so? Okay, so finally, and as discussed earlier, delegated proof of stake consensus mechanisms as used in EOS, they restrict validating entities by political rather than economic means. So this, in effect, artificially restricts the number of nodes who are able to propagate transactions throughout the protocol, which creates a de facto and technical authority to censor transactions. So this was demonstrated almost as soon as the EOS mainnet was launched, with EOS block producers freezing accounts, which were allegedly involved in some scams to defraud EOS token holders. So while the EOS draft constitution had laid out some mechanisms by which disputes were to be governed or are to be governed, EOS block producers were rather able to freeze those accounts after a conference call attended by most block producers, and a dispute resolution body known as ECAF, or the EOS Core Arbitration Forum, only retroactively issued a statement supporting the decision to freeze those accounts. So what this does, or what this episode does, is really neatly demonstrates the crucial difference between a de jure and a de facto constitutional arrangement. So you can consider a de jure constitution to be one which is written, but a de facto constitution is one which is actually enacted in real life, depending on technical abilities and norms of a community. So finally, I'll just put up some references, and all this will be available later online. But I will now stop sharing the screen, and I believe we will move on to some questions or comments. There we go.
Right. Thank you so much. And I only caught one small error. I think it might be an error that I'll want to correct when it's my turn to have comments. But first, let me bring up on screen our outline and share that with folks so we can stay orderly. Right, so that was the, just completed was section 2, which was the presentation. And big thanks again to our speaker. Now we'll go round robin. I'll just call you in the order that we see you listed in Lucid and ask you to give between 3 and 5 minutes of feedback on what you heard, what you thought. Be respectful yet constructive. If you love something, say that. If you find yourself challenged or disbelieving, say that. If you thought you see an error or an alternative interpretation, any feedback at all to help our presenter learn and grow and be ever more persuasive and ever more thorough. And so with that, the ordering is Darcy, Alastair, myself, Sinclair, then Brandon, then Douglas, then Adam. So Darcy, are you ready to kick it off?
Yeah, fantastic. I will say to start off here, I chaired the session when Al presented this last time, so I have already passed on a lot of my comments, but I'll just say a few. I think this is a really, really interesting field to think about, and in part because we're taking decades of political theory that has already existed and we've thought about for a long time and applying it to this new world. One thing that kind of strikes me is that I think we need to acknowledge some of the trade-offs that are inherent here in moving towards this process of constitutional catallaxy. We've gone from what you might think of as constitutions of providing a stable set of rules within which we can invest and exchange and make entrepreneurial judgments and so on, to a process that could potentially be much, much faster. And that brings a lot of uncertainty for entrepreneurs when they're trying to exchange and make contracts. So I think we really need to acknowledge that there is a trade-off here. This is sort of the equivalent, I guess, of regime uncertainty that we would talk about, that you don't know when the rules of the game are going to change, so you're more apprehensive to make longer-term investments. Also, from the perspective of a of a user deciding potentially which blockchain or constitution to use. We went from having largely, you were set in the constitution that you had to use probably by your jurisdiction that you were physically in, but now we've moved into a phase where you have really high potential decision costs of saying there's thousands of potential constitutions out there for me to enter into. Which one should I go into? So I think it's important to acknowledge those decision costs as well. And we even see that from an entrepreneurial side. You talk to people who are in the early stages of their startup and they're going, well, which blockchain do I even use? They're effectively saying, which constitution do I step into? And finally, I'll just note that it could be really interesting to map a lot of these constitutions or blockchains against a range of social philosophies. So some that are more constitutional conservative, or ones that move faster, and so on. And I think there have been a few Medium posts about this that looked at just a few different blockchains, but I think it could be interesting to do a sort of broader mapping. So there's some general comments. So basically, I think we need to acknowledge the trade-offs in that it's moving much faster, and this creates uncertainty for people operating within those particular blockchains. There's higher decision costs for entrepreneurs deciding which blockchain to enter into as they're moving faster. And maybe we can think about this in terms of how conservative or not conservative they are constitutionally. But I think it was fantastic. Thank you very much, Al, for presenting. I really enjoyed it.
Super. Well, thank you, Darcy. So again, the order will be myself, Sinclair, Brandon, Douglas, Adam. And so I'm up next. I'll be very quick. The one thing I think was, if I heard you correctly, would have been a challenge to your facts, Alastair, is you said that only the top 21 get paid from inflation. That's not true. There is 1% of inflation. It's divided into a fixed stream of 3/4 of a point, and that goes to vote recipients based on how many votes they get. So you can be well out of the money in terms of making blocks. You get 22nd place, 25th place, 30th, 40th place. You're still getting paid because you're receiving some votes, and that keeps people incentivized to keep trying to get even more votes. Meanwhile, the top 21 then split the remaining 1/4 of 1%. So it's 3/4 of 1% for votes, 1/4 of 1% for blocks. You get paid for every block you make. And so if you're at the top, you're getting both vote pay and block pay. So that top 21 field is pretty lucrative compared to the down the ticket runners up. And those the non-producers, the 22nd place and down, if they're getting 100 EOS tokens or more, they're considered the standby producers, and they make up the reserve, the people we turn to if one or more of the main block producers were somehow unable to produce for a length of time and dropped out of the running. And again, that's just part of the design of the EOS DPoS system. And that's interesting because it also gives rise to another thing we're seeing on EOS mainnet, which is trying to change the rules by having block producers champion a particular rule set that they will enforce if they're in charge. And then if they attract the votes to become up in the top 21, now, oh, it's Tuesday, and I see that the honorable order of tuxedo wearers have made it into the top 21, and they said that they will institute 2% inflation instead of 5% inflation. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next little while until they lose power and drop out. And so there's a potential, just as we heard a moment ago from Darcy, that the rules could change more rapidly in a circumstance like that. If block producers run on if in power, I will follow this set of rules, and then they happen to get into power and enough of them are in agreement, that's what the rules are now. And that creates a kind of systemic risk for the rest of everybody on chain. And I think that we've taken the incredible slowness and difficulty of constitutional change for granted as something to be overcome, when in fact it may be a great attribute, not a bug but a feature, and that making rule changes hard, they can be too hard, but they can be too easy as well. And we'll see. And I would close by recommending to you the game Flux, F-L-U-X-X. or the more highbrow nomic, N-O-M-I-C, as two different games one can play if one wants to play the game. What are the rules? Because they both involve ongoing rule changes as being the gameplay. And that's the extent of my thoughts today. And thank you, Alastair, for, I've seen a version of this once before. I read the Medium post version, and this is getting better and better every time I experience it.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Just quickly on the, in the inflation, as I was saying that, I knew it was because we in fact know some of the backup block producers, and I thought, no one will notice that I said something wrong, but I forgot that you were here, Thomas.
I'm happy to wordsmith it offline with you if you'd like a little bit of a tweak. So I see Anouk has just joined. So next up will be Sinclair, then Brandon, then Douglas, then Adam, giving feedback to Alastair. So go ahead, Sinclair.
So if I can just sort of riff off those comments. Well, first of all, it's pleasing to see that 3 of my former and current PhD students are working together. So that's quite nice. I was just thinking about constitutions. I mean, I think we kind of know in the real world that making the rules for our constitutions are quite important because the costs of exit are very, very high. By contrast, in the crypto world, the costs of exits are not really that high. We can have forking, people can go off at any particular time. So it may well be that focusing a lot on getting the Constitution right in the first instance isn't as important as actually having that freedom of entry and exit. And as long as people can choose the rules that they want and fork off, as the case may be, it might actually be that we end up with a pretty good constitution, but we don't have to start off with a pretty good constitution. And that would actually be a real world difference compared to what we actually know now and where what's happening in the crypto world. The other is, at a personal preference level, I would prefer it that economic conditions actually determine the rules that we have and not politics. But nonetheless, simply because we also know that politics is inefficient compared to real world. But I think these are very interesting ideas to explore. And I mean, I hadn't really thought too much previously about the idea that Satoshi made the rules all by himself or herself, as the case may be, as opposed to a more decentralized process. So having decentralized constitutions is probably wise, but making sure the costs of exit don't rise is also a good thing, which means we will end up with very good systems in the end.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for those remarks, Sinclair. It's Brandon, Douglas, and Adam Seuss, and if we can each keep to about the 3-minute side of the 3 to 5 minute range, we'll stay on schedule. Go ahead, Brandon. And I think you're still muted.
I really appreciated the slide that you had regarding de facto versus de jure constitutional rules. One thing that we're seeing, and Thomas had hinted at this on the EOS mainnet, is what is written doesn't necessarily reflect what happens, and there's a gap right now in especially with the EOS blockchain between what the written law is and what the acceptable range of behaviors are, right, by the power centers or the stakeholders within the network. One of the gaps that I think that we consistently see is if we treat constitutions like an end user agreement, so where it's a contract between those that are engaging with the network and everybody else, there's a big gap on contract enforceability there, as far as the written law is concerned. Now, when you start getting into de facto constitutions or the unwritten constitution that's there, I think that there's some potential there for kind of this catalactic movement, this liquid nature of a constitution to find its own measure of enforceability, But then what we'll be faced with, and I would love to hear about this, is how do we know where we are with the rule set at any given time if the de facto, or if the written law isn't what's actually followed? Right? How do we know where we are? What's the cultural rules of this game that are going to keep me active on this, or keep me a player on this blockchain right now? That's a question I've got, and I don't know if it's something that can be answered. But it's that contract enforceability. If we look at it as though it were a contract, there's something missing there right now. I think anyway.
Got it. Brandon, thank you for that. After Brandon, Douglas Horn, then Adam Seuss. Douglas.
Hi, thank you. I tend to go long, and I have a sort of a word salad of responses, but so feel free to stop me if I've gone too long. A few things come to me, and so I'm just going to kind of bring them out as they do. First of all, I appreciate your paper very much. I think there are some areas that you might want to address additionally. One is governance as an evolutionary force, which either accelerates or rate limits change. I think we can see both of those forces. If you want me to go follow up on any of these thoughts, I will. But I think you guys were very smart and you understand what I'm talking about there. I think you may have underplayed the importance of a key group, which is the developers. There's a concept I talk about sometime, which is code as law, which is not code is law, but the fact that in blockchain governance, somebody actually has to write the rules, right? A consensus can be built around a constitution or operating agreement or whatever you want, but unless that can be technically implemented, and unless there is a will to technically implement it by the people, by the clergy that are actually able to do that, it doesn't happen. We've seen this numerous times, and I think there's some really good examples in Bitcoin that you could use. There are also some examples in EOS and EOS.io that you could use. So following that line of thinking, we really look at, I think it's worth, in both cases, looking at the result of consensus failure, typically being chain breaks or forks or whatever. And this touches on something you were saying about the freedom to exit. And I would actually disagree with your point respectfully. I actually think that the freedom to exit at this moment is the actual freedom to exit is illusory right now due to the very low adoption. However, as we project forward with crypto in our lives in the future, I think it will not be an easy way. There will not be an easy exit from the largely adopted systems. It will be like going and living in a cave. So that is my impression as we look at that. I think of these, I'd like to sort of focus a little bit on how developers actually drive the chain as something that you're not. So you mentioned there are constitutional changes with consequences for version control. But in fact, I think there's an area of thought there. We can look at how in Bitcoin the reality is there has been actually a lot of development. Even by year 2, Satoshi's code is still only about 10% of the Bitcoin code, and every change is actually a constitutional change because it does this or it does that, and even these small sort of butterfly effect changes do have real impacts on how the system works, if we're going to call that the governance. So I think that you might want to look deeper into how that happens, how how the code, so that's how that relates maybe to Bitcoin, and there's a lot of examples there. I would say with how it relates to EOS in particular, not EOS.io, but they're related. How it relates to EOS is the code that comes out, right? So I see basically we have developers, which are a legislative branch, right? We have validators, which are an executive branch, and we have the delegates, which the token holders, particularly the large token holders who are the voters, and these groups work in concert, but also also against one another. And these, each has, it's funny, there's not the same checks and balances as we see in most sort of bicameral houses or things like that. We see each has a very strong, has the ability sort of to stop progress, to arrest development, but not necessarily always check the power of the others. They're a bit separate. I don't think I can cover that in 3 to 5 minutes. But it's very interesting. I think I think there might be some areas that you could still touch on in terms of developers as a constitutional force, the governance, and the examples of what happens when there is a consensus failure, constitutional failure, and the system must break apart because participants can't agree, and what kind of lines they break apart across. And I think Bitcoin, especially the first 2 Bitcoin Cash forks, are very demonstrative about the alignment of power structures, and how that forces the new constitution. So thanks very much. I hope anything I said was of benefit.
Super. Thank you, Doug. And so Anouk, you're on the list of attendees, but I'm going to skip over you because we're giving comments on the presentation and you weren't able to make it for the presentation portion, although we'd love to have you here. And Adam, you'll be our last person commenting on reactions to Alastair.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for welcoming me on board. I'm quite new to this. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm here mainly as I represent the 16,000 plus members of the organisation that I work for, who are professional accounting and finance members, and obviously are going to be deeply interested and involved in the developments of blockchain and decentralized decision making as was presented today. So I don't really have any intellectual comment to make, unlike everybody else here, so I won't waste everyone's time by trying. So thank you very much. So it's been great to listen to, and I appreciate the welcome that you've shown me.
Super. Okay. So that's our Q&A section. What we next do is, I'll advance here to section 4. Sort of an open table discussion, and in this section what we want to do is just go around, and again 1 to 2 minutes per person. And here what I'm going to ask you to consider are future topics, future speakers, or recommendations for how we conduct ourselves as a group. And that could be anything from a complaint or criticism or an irritation to a full-blown suggestion. And in particular, I'd like this to put in bounds, at least for today. Let's try this on. If you're slightly irritated by something, irritation is soft anger, and anger is the emotion you feel when your values or your boundaries are violated. And so often irritation is the first way you can notice that there's an improvement opportunity. So what I would ask everyone to do is don't be overly nice, but rather if you're feeling bothered by something, or you feel like there's there's something missing, voice it, even if you don't know what it is. And that'll be the raw material for our overall improvement. And I'll go in roughly the same order. It'll be Darcy, Alastair, myself, Sinclair, Brandon, Douglas, Anouk, and Adam, in that order. And if you think of something later, we'll do a last catch-up round. But 1 to 2 minutes, starting with Darcy, then Alastair, and then on around, just in terms of, for the good of the order, speakers, topics, systems improvements. And I see Brandon had his hand up. Is there something else you want to say, Brandon?
I was just going to say anybody's welcome to make their own notes if they're logged into the Lucid meeting as well on these suggestions that they have.
Yeah, the things at Lucid become part of the record that we mail around. So if you scroll to the very bottom, there's a chat in the lower right. There's an add notes there on the left-hand side. So if you happen to be in Lucid, that's Lucid is where we track our meetings. Anything that happens in Lucid is real and true. Anything that isn't is ephemeral and deniable later, unless you find the video. So with that charming thought, I'm going to call on Darcy and then Alastair to give us 1 to 2 minutes of just general purpose. What ought we do next as a group?
Fantastic. Thanks, Thomas. Nothing comes to mind particularly straight away. I think it'd be good to get some more external speakers in, but I guess that brings up the question of, which we haven't particularly discussed, who are members, who are participants, is there a membership fee? And as we expand the group, I don't know to what extent we are expanding it. Is this format scalable? I mean, we probably can't go around to do 3 to 5 minutes with every single person. So I think it would be good to be able to have other people listening in, but not necessarily having to contribute too much. But that's obviously a big open discussion by itself. So that they're the main things that come to mind. But external speakers would be great. I love hearing about RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub stuff, but of course I'm commenting on stuff that I have been quite involved in, and I know a lot of people have here as well. So yeah, that's about all I've got at the minute, but maybe come back to me after other people have said stuff.
Okay, thank you, Darcy. Alastair, then me, then Sinclair. Alastair.
Yeah, so I second what Darcy said. We are obviously fantastic, of course, but we should certainly get in some external speakers. I know in the past we have put together some lists. So in some previous meeting notes, I know we've got some suggested speakers who we were certainly going to reach out to and see if they could speak. Quickly, while we're talking about speakers, I know for suggested speakers, I know Jason was obviously meant to talk today, but he discovered that he's actually on a plane at the moment, just due to some scheduling issues. He is, of course, keen to again speak potentially at the next meeting. If we can get an external speaker, then that, you know, I'm sure he wouldn't mind pushing back if we can get someone to speak next month. I know Jason is very keen to talk on some of Ostrom's work, which I know that some people here are very interested in. In terms of materials to give to external people to perhaps invite them in and start thinking about membership fees and membership arrangements, I've actually got some stuff which I'll share around, which I think I was meant to share around earlier, which I didn't, so apologies about that. I will share that around to the group today, and if people can, if we can start a conversation on that, that would be fantastic. And that is it for me.
Outstanding. Thank you, Alastair. Right. So when I mentioned speakers, I want to just say from my knowledge, we've got Brandon scheduled for February. March is open. Jason can certainly have March. And I'd love for us to be scheduled 2-3 months out. So picking somebody for April would be certainly in bounds. And I'd love to know who people would like to suggest. I do love the fact that we're growing, and I hope we continue to grow both organically and through maybe very structured campaigns. We do have a legal entity of sorts. I've filed ISSDG as a legal entity in the state of Oregon in the United States. And so we have the option to open a bank account if we want to, and we could take people's dues money and start filing paperwork with the government and all that kind of glorious stuff. And as I contemplate that, I'm wondering if I should just reincorporate in Estonia or something.
Or just launch a blockchain and say, screw it.
There you go. And then no one would be in charge and nothing could be good.
Because that's why we all got into crypto, right? So that we could have more organization and government filings and things.
Yeah. In terms of scaling, I know of a number of ways we could scale things up into the 100+ people range and still staying within the time. So I'm perhaps overly confident in our ability to handle a large turnout, but we'll see if that ever becomes a real challenge or not. And yeah, that's all I can think of to mention. I'm happy with our organic process so far, and I'm going to make a note to myself, or actually I'll ask maybe Brandon to make a note since I'm talking, that in our opening slide, instead of saying state the purpose, we like find our purpose statement and just stick it in the meeting, and I can read it out loud. I don't have to remember the darn thing, and use that as a job aid to add a little more structure. So that was it for me. Sinclair, then Brandon, then Doug. Sinclair, please.
I have no irritations at all. I'm really enjoying the interaction and the feedback and the commentary. So I think it's going really well. And obviously, growth in the future will be awesome. But in the meantime, I'm learning heaps, and I hope everybody else is too.
Outstanding. Thank you, Sinclair. Brandon, then Douglas, then Anouk.
Okay. Yeah, so as far as suggestions for future topics, obviously next month, I've been putting together a presentation on polycentric law, and a concept that I've been working on for dealing with tokens to signal different rule sets and stuff like that. I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you guys and getting some feedback on where I can take that in the future. One of the suggested topics I would like, and it's maybe a little bit taboo from a political correctness side, but I would really like to hear some thoughts on, first of all, why it is that we default into thinking that democratic processes are the right things for blockchain, and specifically diving into what problems, if we default to democratic processes, what problems does that bring into the blockchain, and just have a conversation on specifically that is that, we're all trained to think democracy is a great thing, and so we want to superimpose that into blockchain, but I don't know if it is, and I'd love to hear about that. Yeah, as far as external speaker or future speakers, I don't know. I'm just getting to know you guys over at RMIT, so I am thrilled even with the internal speakers, because I get to hear you guys and hear all the new ideas. So yeah, I look forward to hearing what Jason has to teach us about Ostrom. And as far as recommendations for ISSDG, first of all, yeah, Alastair did reach out to me just a little over a week ago to start talking about some ideas. So I promised Alastair that I would support you in this with that kind of figuring out as far as sponsorship is concerned. And I'll give you that support a little bit more. I'll figure out exactly how I can give you that support, and we can go from there. And then as far as what Thomas was saying, that he's confident that we can handle a format that's with much bigger. If there's anyone that I know that I am convinced could handle putting that together and running a show with 150 people watching, it's Thomas. So I'm not worried about that at all. And that's all I've got.
Thank you, Brandon. Let's see if I get put to the test. I appreciate the confidence. Douglas, Anouk, and Adam. Douglas, please.
Thanks very much. I want to thank everybody for inviting me as a guest. It was very interesting. I don't think I've been at enough meetings or understand the context well enough yet to really offer any valuable feedback, but I will look into it more. It was very interesting for me, and thank you.
And Douglas, thank you for being here. Our original thought process around ISSDG was to try to attract roughly equal numbers of academics and practitioners, and you are definitely on the practitioner end of things, at least in my mind.
Well, it must be, because I'm not on the academic side. So.
Well, you're hands-on every day working on a real-life blockchain whose success or failure affects you personally, and that's not the same, quite the same. I think Brandon and I maybe match the practitioner definition a little bit more, although I think we're both tremendous eggheads.
I will say someday I'm threatening to write some of these things, because it really is interesting, the intersection of the governance side and the practical side. It's quite overlooked. I've been involved for a while, but never to something governed as much as this. Yeah. And the the experience of having, you know, academic to practical discussions about what should be done, what must be done, what people will agree is the right thing to do, and then literally often with the same people or more often with another subset of those people who weren't involved in the conversation, but for me are in the next room leading that team to actually implementation. I personally think that's one of the most appreciated elements of blockchain governance at this moment. So, you know, maybe you'll get a chance to talk more about that.
And for those that don't know, Douglas, he spearheaded the Telos sister chain, some people are calling it, but a blockchain that's running on the EOS.io protocol. So,
yep. Okay, next up, we'll do Anouk and Adam, and let's try and be brief. We're down to about 4 minutes.
Yep. As far as irritation goes, I would certainly be irritated at me if I was any of you guys for coming in late today. So that's certainly an improvement that I can make. I was on another call previously and it ran over. My sincere apologies for missing all the good stuff, all the juicy bits. Apart from that, Brandon, really great concept about, you know, why do we always default to democracy? I've had some discussions around that in groups where I basically just came down to defaulting between, you know, hierarchies are efficient and democracy or, you know, flat structures are fair. And how do we determine which decisions need to be made where? That big topic, would love to explore it. The only other thing that my head keeps coming back to is the concept of publishing. Is there something that, you know, could we put together the 10 simple rules of blockchain governance so that we could put out to any project looking to actually establish governance that could read 10 bullet points and think they know everything there is to know, and you know, at least maybe help prevent some mistakes out there, kind of thinking in that direction.
Plus, it would make a great little marketing tool, wouldn't it?
Great 8,023 simple rules of blockchain governance.
That's a very good idea.
Your number's probably more realistic, but doesn't roll
yeah,
off.
It's closer. It's closer.
Thank you, Anouk. And then lastly, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. No, look, I guess my interest at this stage is I'm considering to set up possibly a local group that would meet face-to-face here. We have discussion groups as part of our membership organisation where we talk about topical issues and yeah, what I may end up being able to take what we potentially look at and talk about here to something at a grassroots level where I'm getting accounting and finance practitioners to come into the room and also listen to it and provide feedback. So that's something I'm looking to set up in the future.
Cool. Thank you, Adam, very much. Okay, our final section after Open Table, and I'll advance here to 5, is it's called the President's Minute, and I want to just review the upcoming schedule. And that is, we've got we are normally the first Wednesday of the month?
I'm not sure that we may have come up with a rule, but I can't personally.
Between the holidays and everything else, whatever it was, it's just blown to heck. So
yeah.
So it's Wednesday in the U.S. and Thursday in Australia because we do it at 0000 hours UTC. And I get the impression our next one is either the 14th or the 21st of February. And I'm wondering if Brandon knows, since he was the one scheduled, he's probably more keenly aware than the rest of us on the day.
I don't know. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah, I'm happy for us just to decree it right now if we'd like to call it either the 14th or 21st. Let me put that up in. Does everyone have?
Can I just suggest we don't do it on the evening of the 14th?
Oh, you're married. That's right. The 14th of February would be contraindicated.
Do you guys have Valentine's Day in Australia? Okay. Okay.
He's a very specific subset of married. He's married, but not all that long. Then, if you still care about Valentine's Day.
Yes, indeed.
Sounds
So
like the 21st.
So we'll say the 21st February at the same hour would be great. We'll share around the notes from this meeting and the recording. And what I'd ask you to do now is in the, not the Zoom chat, but in the Lucid chat, down in the lower right corner, can you all see where the chat is? I'm going to put in the word it's here. That's my entry into group chat. And what I'd like you to do is go into that and type in a word, a phrase, a sentence, a thought of the one thing you most liked about this hour, but only one. And it can be small or just, whimsical or whatever. And it's objective, subjective, but just, what did you like the most? Even a single word is great. So I've seen Adam, Brandon, Alastair, Doug.
Sinclair has run away, so he won't be doing anything.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think pretty much everyone has typed something, and that'll also go into our record as well. So that is it. And I'm going to say thank you all very much. Within a couple of days, we'll send around the slides, we'll send around these meeting minute notes, and we'll invite you all by email to the next meeting on the 21st / 22nd in Australia for our next meeting, where it will be Brandon Espinosa speaking on polycentric law. And then March, we're expecting Jason, and would love you to start thinking of who you can invite as an attendee, who you can invite as a speaker, and how you can get the word out about what you learned here today. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.